Okay, so this is just going to be a quick tutorial on how to mix epoxy. I know that sounds like a simple thing to do, but there's a couple of tricks that you might want to know of that can save you some frustrations with your project. So this is Resin Research epoxy. It's a pretty standard, really great epoxy. I love working with it, and so we're going to be measuring by weight in this video. You can measure by volume, but just for this video we're going by weight. The first thing to do would be to read the instructions, because they're obviously important. So mix by weight, we're looking at a ratio of 100 to 45, if you can see that there. So let's just use grams because it's a bit easier. So for 100 grams, we're going to want, for 100 grams of this, which is the resin, we're going to want 45 grams of this, which is hardener. So 100 to 45. So that's our ratio. It's pretty simple. We don't need to mix 100 grams and 45 all the time. We can break that ratio down, and we want to stay pretty close to that ratio, the closest we can. So for the purpose of this video, I don't want to be wasting a ton of epoxy. So I'm going to be pouring about 20 grams of resin, and that means I'm going to want about 9, almost 10 grams of hardener. So that is sticking pretty close to that 100 to 45 ratio. So we're going about 20 to 9-ish grams, and so that keeps the ratio in check, and then that'll ensure that this epoxy cures correctly. So the next step is you want to put on some gloves. You don't want epoxy getting on your skin, so whenever you're working with it, make sure you use some hand protection and avoid getting it on your skin as much as possible. Okay, so this is my dirty but very accurate, still working scale. I use this only for epoxy. That's why it's covered in pretty much a ton of old epoxy and a little bit of paint, but I keep the reading clear so I can see how much I'm measuring out, and that's pretty much the only purpose I need this for. If you're going to be working with epoxy a good amount, I recommend getting a scale like this. They're very cheap. You can get them at most stores and or online really cheaply, and it just makes everything a lot easier. And you really need a scale if you're going to be measuring by weight. If you're just doing a one-off quick little project, you can measure by volume, but if you're measuring by weight, which I highly recommend, get yourself a cheap little scale. It'll save you a ton of time. And so this is the part where these are some of the tips and tricks, is the container that you are going to mix your epoxy in. Either this is a foam cup, and this is a great container. I use this most common. You can use plastic containers as well, but if you're looking for a disposable option, foam cups are going to be your best bet. Avoid using paper cups at all costs, because paper cups have usually they have some sort of wax lining on the inside, and that wax will get into your epoxy and it'll really mess up your final epoxy product. So absolutely avoid any sort of paper cup unless it's specifically just paper, no wax lining, but I don't even think that exists. So these are cheap foam cups. You can get these in bulk online, or I used to get them at the dollar store too. So you get like a pack of like 30 cups for $1, which was pretty good. So for this example, I'm using this foam cup. Also, I have these jumbo popsicle sticks. Again, you can get these really cheap online in bulk. You can also get them at the dollar store, I think. So really cheap, really simple, and these are just nice and clean, and that's why I like to use them. Okay, so let's get started here, and I'm just going to put my cup on the scale, zero it out with the cup. The cup's only a few grams anyway, so I'm at 0 grams right now. I'm going to take my epoxy resin, pour that in, and I want about 20 grams here. So as you can see, I got 23, and let's see if I can get this up to 24. It'll just be a little bit easier on the math. Okay, so 24 grams. So keeping to that ratio, it's just easiest to, let's just divide 24 in half, which is 12, and then take a little bit off. So we want probably around 11 grams will keep us within that ratio. And then 24 plus 11 is 35. So now I'm just going to bring the scale as close to 35 as I can. 34. There's 35. And working with smaller batches, it's a little bit harder to get that ratio correct, just because of the pour and because of the only weighing by 1 gram instruments. So with larger batches, you'll be more accurate, but I know this is going to be plenty fine because I've done this hundreds of times before. So now we have our epoxy weighed out and in the cup, and now it's time to start mixing. So when mixing in a container, I know that sounds pretty simple, but the main issue is epoxy that is around the edges and the bottom not getting completely mixed. And again, that might cause some issues. Say if you're doing a gloss coat, if you have some resin that hasn't mixed thoroughly, it'll kind of show up in your final product. So the way I like to do it is just generally mix pretty much how you would in a circle, right? And then every now and then scrape the sides of the entire container. So I'm working the container around while scraping it, and then I'm going to scrape the bottom of the container as well, and then go back to the circular motion. Scrape the sides, hit the bottom, and then again continue mixing. And so just a couple cycles of that will generally get you in a good mix. And after that, your epoxy is now mixed and it's ready to be used. Okay, so I know that seems pretty simple, but there's a couple tips in there that are important. The first is to get that ratio as close to being accurate as possible. That'll just ensure the strongest epoxy you can get, and the finishes will turn out well. The other tip is the container that you're mixing in. Again, paper cups, definitely avoid that. You want a nice clean container. So I know these foam cups are nice and clean and they work very well. And the last tip is thoroughly mixing. And so really the only thing you need to keep in mind there is scraping along the sides of the container and then also the bottom, because there's a layer of the epoxy resin that's just kind of sticking to the side, and it doesn't want to mix as well if you're just going circles in the center. So you want to scrape that, work it in, and then mix that as well. And since we have some epoxy here and we just did the demonstration, lastly there is pot life. And pot life refers to how long epoxy can sit in a pot and be usable. Epoxy generates heat as it cures. So eventually when it's really built up, say in a cup like this, and not spread out, the heat builds up even faster. And that's especially true in a foam container. That's a great insulator, so it keeps that heat in. So eventually this epoxy that is down in the bottom of this cup is going to get noticeably warm. And if I leave it in here, just like this, and I will for the demonstration, it will actually get really hot and some steam will come off, some bubbles will start forming, and this will go from a warm liquid to a solid rather quickly. And so that's what they refer to the pot life. I believe with this, it's about 20-ish minutes. With this foam cup, it might speed that process up. So we might be looking around 15 minutes. This might start to kick off. And so when it starts to go, I'll break the camera out and we'll take a look so we can see what that looks like. Okay, so this epoxy is starting to kick off and we can feel the heat. And you can see that we now have this lump forming here. You might be able to see some steam coming off, and that's because this is getting very, very warm. So that's what they refer to as pot life. This has happened, I mean, just in the time we see, now it is all pretty much completely solid, and I can't even lift up that hardened portion of epoxy. So again, that heat, when trapped in a pot like this, will build up very fast, and it will cause your epoxy to harden almost instantaneously, or at least within 20 to 30 seconds. So that is what they refer to as pot life. And yeah, you can see that the epoxy did its thing. It went from a liquid into a hard, durable solid It's just with pot life, that's just how long you can keep it liquid in a pot. It's as simple as that.